I want to ask you a rhetorical question. When was the last time you asked an African-American man, how do you feel? Not how you're doing, but how do you feel? In fact, would you even consider asking that question? Don't ask that yet. Consider this data. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Minority Health, the death rate of suicide for African-American men was more than 4 times greater than African-American women in 2017. A 2018 study by the National Institute for Mental Health indicated that the suicide rate was roughly 2 times likely than for black youth compared to white youth ages 5 to 17. And among men aged 18 to 44 who experience daily feelings of depression and anxiety, black and Hispanic men were half as likely than whites to have used mental health treatment. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a crisis, but it goes even deeper than that. From the Middle Passage in the early 16th century, through the days of slavery, to the Jim Crow era, more recently to the public deaths of George Floyd, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, and many, many more, our black men are being pushed to the limits of the stress they endure every single day. You see, the African-American community has had centuries of multi-generational trauma, otherwise known as post-traumatic slave syndrome. Post-traumatic slave syndrome was posited by Dr. Joy Garee, a social worker and researcher whose book by the same name takes an unflinching look at the impact of this trauma on the collective experience of African Americans. Imagine you're a black man getting ready to leave your home, knowing that it's possible you may not return safely every single day. This creates stress. This stress contributes to the fight, flight, or freeze response, which causes your brain to release an excess of cortisol, and your mind goes into an automatic state of adrenaline-pumping, heightened awareness. This heightened state of hypervigilance is a primary risk factor for many mental health conditions, including depression and anxiety. These conditions can be debilitating. We're taught to never reveal our emotions. Case in point, my father lived until he was 87. He was a proud man, the kind of guy any kid would be happy to have as a father. But never in my lifetime did I ever see him outwardly express any feelings of sadness or anxiety, despite all he had been through in his life. He was stoic when my mother died in 1996 after 39 years of marriage. In 2018, there were 21 million African American men living in the United States. 21 million people who simply by virtue of their gender and color of their skin were at risk. In the words of Reverend George Nicholas, pastor of Lincoln United Methodist Church here in Buffalo, being a black man in America is a pre-existing condition for having a mental illness. As you heard in my opening comments, many African American men are living with anxiety, depression, or both. And these are just the cases that are reported. Undoubtedly, many more suffer in silence. So why is it so critical? Let me share a few reasons why. First, there's stigma. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines stigma as a mark of shame or discredit. There's a long-standing history in the African-American community of negatively characterizing individuals living with mental illness. You might hear things like, oh, Uncle Johnny's just off, or it may not be spoken of at all. I have another question for you. What do you think a person who lives with a mental illness looks like? Well, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 1 out of 5 people lives with a diagnosable mental health condition in the US in any given year. And I happen to be one of those people. You see, I had my first bipolar psychotic episode when I was a college freshman at General Motors Institute in Flint, Michigan in 1981. My parents made the trip all the way from Buffalo and brought me home. My mother was crushed. Here I was, her only son, who was also adopted, who was now living with an incurable disease. She struggled with accepting my condition and did her best to keep my ailment secret from her friends. This was due to stigma. To have a child who was impacted in such a way was a reflection of her abilities as a mother, I think she believed. It eventually got to the point where she couldn't even visit me when I was hospitalized. In the 8 years that I cycled in and out of institutions, we rarely discussed my mental health at home, with the exception of the time for me to get my medication from the pharmacy. It was the biggest elephant in the room you can imagine. In the African American community, our men are expected to be strong, capable, and unbreakable. Any appearance otherwise makes us seem weak. This is another case where stigma affects Black men. And did you know that it could take 10 years for the average person to seek help when they're living with a mental illness? If they seek help at all. And for Black men, this average is likely higher. Many who are affected this way don't reach out for the help they so desperately need. When a Black man is struggling with his mental health, he's in the unenviable position of having to keep his feelings to himself. This creates a need to mask these feelings and maintain a facade of invulnerability. This additional stressor compounds on top of the original problem, what then results are symptoms that feed off each other that plunges him into a deeper sense of despair. Another consequence of the mask that African American men wear is in how we're perceived. We're often seen to be dangerous and threatening. Many of these misconceptions have been coming from images we see in the media. For more than a century, we've seen these images from movies like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. For more than a century, they've been shown in our movies, TV shows, news, and most recently in social media. It's no wonder there's such a profound misunderstanding of how Black men truly feel. Another condition that affects Black men is vicarious trauma, which is associated with witnessing another person's traumatic event. Consider Daniel Prude, who lived in Rochester, New York. Prude was hooded and pinned to the ground by police while naked in March of 2020. He died a week after this incident. The critical factor here is how a defenseless person living with a mental illness could be so severely brutalized for something which he had no control over. This made national news and contributed to the vicarious trauma that so many Black men experience. And then there's the case of Willie Henley, a Black man from Buffalo who also lives with a mental illness. He had an altercation with police in the summer of 2020 where he was shot despite only carrying a baseball bat. Regardless of Henley's part in this incident, this is yet another in a multitude of examples from across our country that reinforces the need for a better approach to how these types of situations are handled. Both of the events were broadcast by major media outlets. There is a huge outcry from both the African American community as well as mental health advocates. Underlying this, however, is the vicarious trauma that Black men experience every time these images are seen. This is all exacerbated by the advent of the camera phone as well as police video. Whenever these images are viewed, they can cause a stress that leads to the fight, flight, or freeze response that I spoke about earlier. I vividly recall seeing Willie Henley's story in the news. I thought to myself, that could be me. You see, I had experience at a psychiatric emergency room in 1989 where I became agitated and had to be subdued by 2 security officers and placed in 4-point restraints. This was an extremely traumatizing experience for me. And while I'm far from that place in my life, I can never forget it. Now, you might be saying to yourself, that's a pretty extreme example. That doesn't happen to most people. You may be right, but consider in the broader aspect of what Black men face every time we have an encounter with law enforcement. The sheer necessity of not making the wrong move or saying the wrong thing can lead to the stress that leads to depression, anxiety, or other mental health related conditions. How'd you feel if you had to face that potential situation every day? Let that sink in for a second. So where does this leave us? There are many people who feel that the U.S. mental health system is broken, to which in part, I'd agree. Part of this reason, I believe, is due to the disparities in the criminal justice system. Now, I know I'm talking about mental health, but you can't discuss the criminal justice system without also considering the mental well-being of those that are incarcerated. A report published by the NAACP indicated that African Americans are 5 times more likely than whites to be incarcerated. The same report stated that 10 to 20% of the inmate population lives with a serious mental illness, which will worsen over the period of time they're in prison. You do the math. I have a friend, Baba Ng, who spent 37 years in prisons across New York State. Baba suffered the trauma of solitary confinement while being placed naked and shackled in a cell no larger than a small walk-in closet. This left an indelible mark in him, and it's any wonder that he's able to accept how this ordeal has affected his life. Remember at the beginning of COVID, when we were forced into our homes in lockdown? Imagine that for 37 years. There are a few other issues I'd like to share with you that pertain to Black men, and these are the disparities in mental health. African Americans comprise 12% of the US population. However, there are only 2% of psychiatrists, 2% of psychologists, or 4% of social workers. There are far too few providers of color. Another issue is that many people feel that going to therapy is a one-size-fits-all proposition. It's not, especially in matters that relate to race and ethnicity. There's a significant need for Black men to have someone with whom they can relate to culturally to develop a healthy therapeutic alliance. Now, I'm not saying that mental health professionals from other ethnicities can't be beneficial. What I'm saying, however, is that we need to eliminate as many barriers as possible that prevent Black men from seeking help. Another thing is that there are some people in the Black community who feel that going to counseling is a quote-unquote white thing. This idea needs to be eliminated. There are many people, and many Black men that I know, who are getting professional help, as well as those I've seen in community forums online, that say it's been beneficial for them. Personally, as someone who's been in therapy for most of my lifetime, I can attest to the many benefits of having a non-judgmental guide who's been able to help me through the many challenges I've experienced over the years. For me, going to counseling and getting psychiatric support is a healthy thing to do. What I presented to you so far is what I call the crisis. Now I want to talk about the opportunity. We're at a crossroads in Black mental health. There are many in our next generation of younger African Americans who are both raising awareness and fighting stigma. Organizations like BEAM, the Black Emotional Mental Health Collective, and the Boris L. Henson Foundation, founded by actress Taraji P. Henson, are turning the tide to provide resources for Black men that are reflective of the cultures from which we come. One of the organizations that I belong to is the Buffalo Center for Health Equity's African American Health Equity Task Force, which focuses on the mental health needs of the West York Black community. Among other things, we educate and advocate for the cause of mental wellness for Black men. We're creating an initiative to equip barbers with tools like mental health training to empower them to help their clients. Barbers are an integral part of our community and can be instrumental in raising awareness in both a powerful and an authentic manner. We're also going to be using community mental health workers to go into these barbershops to educate the clients in a similar fashion as was done for programs that focus on HIV and AIDS. The main reason I'm so passionate about these issues is I know with the proper support and resources, we can help our Black men who face centuries of challenges that affected their mental health. So, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, provide support to our next generation of African American men by providing aid to organizations that promote programs like mentoring. Research shows that mentoring is a proven protective factor against mental illness. By providing our youth with positive role models, we can help them to develop the skills to manage their emotional well-being. Second, educate yourself, not just by reading books, watching documentaries, or scrolling through social media. Take the time to talk with us. When we have the opportunity to dialogue, we can break down the barriers that perpetuate stereotypes. And last, but not least, empathize with us. Take the time to try to identify with our feelings and see yourself in our shoes. When you do, you'll be able to gain a better understanding of how Black men truly feel. Think about what I've shared. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, the impact of police brutality, and centuries of oppression and discrimination. Now, I want you to reconsider the two questions I asked you. When was the last time you asked an African-American man how you feel? And what do you think a person who lives with a mental illness looks like? What do you think? Will you consider our worldview? And if you do, will you join us and bring about the changes that help our Black men to heal from the deep emotional wounds that we've had for so long? I hope you do. Thank you.